We've looked at both Ilford HP5 and Portra 160 so far on the Overexposure versus Underexposure series. Today, we're going to take a look at Cinestill 50D. Cinestill 50D is a film stock which I've never actually shot before, but is one that I've been wanting to shoot for a while now, particularly due to its characteristics of somewhat emulating the look of traditional motion picture film. So, whilst for the first two film stocks in this series, I had already an idea of what the results were going to look like, for this one I was treating it like valuable research into understanding how I'd like to meter my shots when shooting Cinestill 50D in the future. As with the previous iterations in this series, I shot the same image of my conservatory, with some strong contrast between harsh shadows outside and under the furniture inside, and the bright highlights of the sun streaking through the windows. I used the same camera and lens, being the Pentax 6.7 and the 75mm, so that contrast affected by the lens was similar, and I rated the film at the box speed of ISO 50. I metered using a spot meter and an app on my phone, which pretty much emulates how I would typically expose when I was creating images for real. So let's take a look at the completely unedited exposures one by one, and then compared to the base level correct exposure. As we found with the other two negative film stocks that we shot, Cinestill 50D deals much better with overexposure than it does underexposure. We do get some colour shifts, particularly as you begin to really overexpose the film, and of course as we begin to underexpose, we do also lose a lot of detail. At 1 and 2 stocks overexposed, the image remains quite similar to the base exposure. We do begin to see a shift to slightly cooler and more green tones, but it's not too extreme, and as expected we begin to see some more detail in the shadows, particularly under the table here and in the trees outside. The highlights actually stay at a really similar level and don't begin to lose any detail comparatively to the normal exposure. I'd comfortably overexpose Cinestill 50D by 1 or 2 stops and correct the slight blue tint in post very happily. At 3 and 4 stops overexposed, the colour shift becomes much more noticeable. The image has a much cooler tone to it, which you may actually like as a creative choice. The shadows have an incredible amount of detail in them, so if you want that lower contrast look with great shadow details, 3 or even 4 stops overexposed is probably how I would do it. I should note also that although the highlights do get noticeably brighter here, they were still able to be pulled back and edited without clipping, and they retained all of the detail. So it's a big thumbs up for overexposing Cinestill 50D. As we found in the other tests, it only improves the shadow detail whilst pretty much retaining all of the highlight information, but do keep in mind that with this particular film stock, the image tends to shift slightly cooler and has a more green tint the more that you overexpose it. As for underexposure, Cinestill 50D once again, like with Portra 160 and Ilford HP5, began to fall apart quite quickly. At 1 stop underexposed, I do actually think that it still produces a really nice image. We do begin to lose a bit of detail in the darkest shadows, as you can see outside in the trees, but the colours don't shift too badly and the overall image still actually looks pretty good. 2 stops underexposed isn't too different. We of course lose a little bit more detail, but colours once again remain consistent. The image still looks clean and hasn't gotten too muddy in these mildly dark shadow areas. If you're into that slightly underexposed image, which can often actually produce very creative and stylistic results, I think this is really nice. It does also actually, as a side effect, minimise the prominence of the halation around the really bright highlights. So if that's something that you're looking for, just note that does happen if you underexpose, because those highlights aren't quite as bright. At 3 stops and 4 stops underexposed are where we quickly begin to deteriorate. It's the same story, a severe lack of detail in shadows as we introduce less and less exposure to the film, and although the colours actually remain quite neutral, everything does take on that slightly purple and dark blue, brown, muddy quality to the shadows, which, if you edit to be pure black, introduces insane levels of contrast to the image. I personally think 3 stops is just about usable for stylistic choices. I would definitely never underexpose Cinestill 50D by 4 stops though. Of course, I did take a very swift and unscientific attempt at editing all of the exposures to become similar to the base exposure, so that you can see how far you can push each of the exposures to get back to that optimal, correctly exposed image, and how easy it is also to correct any color shifts that there may be. In terms of these edited images, all 4 stops of overexposure actually edited quite well. I didn't spend a crazy long time on them at all, but you can see that if you overexpose Cinestill 50D, you should be able to edit your scans to get the desired look. As for underexposure, I do think that 1 and 2 stops underexposed edited really nicely back to that base level of exposure. I would be happy with both of these results if they were my final product after editing. 3 and 4 stops underexposed, however, just produced too grungy and contrasty a final look for me that I found really quite difficult to get back to this even somewhat comparable stage. It definitely doesn't look anything like the base exposure, really, at least compared to 3 and 4 stops overexposed, which edited quite well. In conclusion, my recommendation is probably to shoot Cinestill 50D at a base exposure of ISO 50, or perhaps to overexpose by 1 stop. I like warm images, so I'd be less inclined to shoot 2, 3 or even 4 stops overexposed, but if you do want the most shadow detail as possible, it's definitely great at retaining highlights, and you can correct the slightly cooler and green color tint that is introduced. If you're going for that pastel, less contrast look, 3 stops overexposed is what I would say. I do actually think that there is merit to underexposing Cinestill 50D as well, by 1 or maybe even 2 stops for creative purposes, particularly if you like that moodier and darker look, but I would never delve into the realms of 3 or 4 stops underexposed. I think that's just a little bit too far gone. I hope that if you've shot Cinestill 50D, or if you're planning to, maybe this video was somewhat helpful to you. I'll leave a link in the description to the other videos in the series if you are interested in seeing how Ilford HP5 or Portra 160 holds up in the exact same tests. If you like the video, please feel free to leave me a like and let me know your thoughts on the findings down below in the comments, and consider subscribing if you do want to see any more from me. Stay safe everybody, stay happy, and I'll see you in the next one.